So let's talk about the early Federalist era. So when we say the early Federalist era, we're talking about a couple of things. This is the time period that covers the Washington administration and the Adams administration. This is the time period that we refer to as the Federalist era because this is the first time that the federal government is being referred to as a federal government because it is superior to the state governments. We are calling this the Federalist government partially because the Federalist political party is in charge. The constitutional government has now replaced the Confederation government. It gives the government the power to tax, to have a military. It has the supremacy clause, so the federal government is now superior to the state governments. It is a strong national government led by General George Washington. The government is structured similar to what we talked about before. The branches are seen as equals. Congress is seen as the closest to the will of the people, though, because they're directly elected. So, say, for example, the House of Representatives has the ability to tax. All the tax bills have to start there because of the no taxation without representation idea. There is a new executive branch, which is supposed to provide guidance for the government. Washington is made the first president, unanimously elected by the Electoral College. Washington sets a number of very important precedents, not presidents, but precedents, meaning he is the first to do something and it is going to be done later. The first and probably most important is that he develops a cabinet. He understands that as president, he's going to have to make decisions that maybe are out of his general knowledge base. So he gathers up as many smart people as he can and puts them into a group of advisors called a cabinet. The executive branch cabinet is going to become important. We still have it today. It's much larger than it was in Washington's day. The two most important people that we talk about in Washington's cabinet are his Department of State. We call him the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and the Department of Treasury, led by the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. We also have the first judicial branch. This is going to be led by the Chief Justice John Jay, one of the Federalist authors. But until Marbury versus Madison, which we'll talk about in the next video, the Supreme Court doesn't really mean much. Let's go through the Bill of Rights really quickly, because the Bill of Rights was accepted as the first 10 amendments. So these were changes to the Constitution implemented almost immediately upon its ratification. The First Amendment, right to free speech, freedom of and freedom from religion, meaning there's no state-sponsored religion, freedom of the press, freedom to petition or write requests to the government, and the freedom to assemble. Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia, does have the right to bear arms. Interestingly, when we look at Federalist number 29, written by Alexander Hamilton, this was supposed to replace an active military. The Founding Fathers were very concerned about having a large standing military that could become tyrannical. So the idea would be that private citizens would own weapons, but they would have to be, the citizens would be part of a state-controlled militia. That way the national government wouldn't have too much power, and the states would be able to have these militias to provide for, one, common defense against foreign enemies, but number two, it would also be used to put down domestic rebellions, which we'll see in just a minute. Number three is the Quartering Act. They were unhappy about the British soldiers being sent into their homes after the Boston Tea Party. The Quartering Act, no quartering of soldiers. Number four is the search warrants. Again, a response to those writs of assistance, which were seen as a violation of their rights. The Fifth Amendment, due process rights, double jeopardy, meaning you can't be tried for the same crime twice, and you have a right not to incriminate yourself. You don't have to say that you're guilty of a crime. The Sixth Amendment was the right to a speedy jury trial for the criminal acts, and the Seventh was a right to a jury trial for civil acts, which means not a crime, but things like being sued. You have a jury for that. The Eighth is no cruel and unusual punishments. The Ninth Amendment says that the rights 1 through 8 are not the only rights that are to be set aside for people. And the 10th Amendment says that if something's not listed in the Constitution, that power is reserved for the states. That's going to become a very important one later when we start talking about things like states' rights and the Virginia and Kentucky resolution and those arguments that are going to be had. Okay, some of the precedents that Washington creates. Number one, He says that it's the president's job to enact the will of Congress. President Washington does have the ability to veto acts of Congress, but he says it's not really his job to do that because Congress is closest to the people. Number two, he also retires after 2 terms. This becomes an important precedent because future presidents will not run more than 2 terms, arguing that if Washington wasn't able to handle it, they shouldn't do it either. This is going to happen. This is going to be a precedent that stays in place until the 1940s, when Franklin Roosevelt runs for a 3rd and eventually 4th term and is elected. After that, they turn it into an amendment to make sure that presidents can only run 2 times. President Washington also created a cabinet of advisors, and he thought that there wouldn't be factions within the parties, right? He didn't think that there would be parties that emerged with people fighting over things. So he did not really think about Jefferson and Hamilton and their opposition to each other when he asked them to be part of the cabinet. He was just trying to get smart people into this cabinet. So let's talk about this bitter feud between Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton had a financial vision for the country that's going to be radically different than the one Jefferson has. First of all, Hamilton wanted to base his ideas on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. He wanted a capitalist economy with people working in industry and people working to produce finished products that could then be sold to other Americans and on the world market. He believed in the idea of machinery being used in factories. So he wants a capitalist economy. He wants an industrial nation. He believed in revenue, right? He wanted to raise revenue, and that requires 1, a tariff, which is going to be a tax on imported goods, and 2, a tax on Americans through things like excise taxes. And we're going to see that this is going to lead to sectional differences. The North is going to be very much based in industry, and the South is going to be agricultural, and they're going to dislike a lot of things that Hamilton does. Hamilton wanted to establish a public credit. And what this means is that he wanted the United States to have the ability to borrow money. You can't borrow money without having good credit. And the way that you get good credit is by showing that you can handle debt. So the United States Hamilton wanted the United States to take on debt so that it could pay off the debt to prove they could handle more debt. This is kind of like what Mr. Chappell talked to you about with credit cards, I'm assuming. So the United States government he wants the United States government to assume or take over all of the Revolutionary War debts that the states would have had. He wanted to do that so that there would be a debt that the United States government could pay off, and it would help build their credit. He also wanted to get the states to support the new federal national government. If the United States took over the state debts of, say, New York, and New York didn't have to pay off those debts, well, that's going to get New York to be on the side of the national government. And thirdly, he thought that it would promote national unity. If there was this common debt that everyone was paying, it would help to promote unity among the states. This is also going to lead to sectional differences, partially because the Southerners, except for South Carolina, all the Southern states paid off their war debts. So they didn't want their tax money to be going to pay for Northern war debts. Other people in the South thought that this was a trick by those wealthy Northern investors to get their money, tax money, into the wealthy investors' pockets. And lastly, here, there's going to be a need to raise revenue to pay off the taxes. This is going to lead to a number of different things. 1, a tariff, and a tariff is going to tax imported goods. And what that does is leads to higher prices for foreign products, let's say cloth. But what that means is that Northern factories are also going to increase their prices, but still keep it cheaper than the foreign products. So yes, it's increasing the revenue, but it's also artificially increasing prices. And that's going to make the Southerners, who don't have a lot of industry, mad. This is also going to lead to an excise tax, or a tax on a particular product. In this case, we're going to be seeing a tax on whiskey. Don't let anybody fool you. This isn't about drinking. This is about creating a tax on a popular product. Now, the Southern states are only going to accept this idea of assuming the state's debts if the Northerners compromise with them on something. There was a debate happening at the time of this compromise on whether or not, where to build a state capital. The state capital had been alternating between Philadelphia and New York City. The Southerners were wanting that to be more southern, partially because of travel, but mostly because they wanted to have it in an area where they could have more influence. So the Southerners agreed to pay off to have the national government assume the state debts if the capital was moved into Virginia, today what we call the Washington, D.C. Another controversial thing, in addition to the assumption controversy and the credit, is the creation of a national bank. Hamilton wanted a national bank. One, it would store all the revenues from the new taxes and tariffs. And two, it could loan out money to spur new industrial benefits or new industrial developments. It would also be a way to control the money supply, which would help to create a more stable money. This is going to be the first major conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson. The Constitution does not mention a bank anywhere in it. And this is going to be where Hamilton and Jefferson are going to disagree on how to interpret the Constitution, which I think is interesting because the people that wrote the Constitution, Hamilton, now Jefferson wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, but Madison was, and Madison was Jefferson's partner in his party. So Hamilton and Madison are going to disagree about what the Constitution even meant, and they wrote the thing. They're going to disagree on how to interpret it. Jefferson and his political party is going to want strict constitutional interpretation. And what this means is that the national government can only do what the Constitution specifically allows it to do. If the Constitution does not say the word bank, that means that the government cannot create a national bank. Now, Hamilton is going to look at it from the other point of view. He wants loose interpretation. Hamilton says that the Constitution does not say that creating a national bank is prohibited. He agrees with Jefferson. The Constitution doesn't say anything about a bank. So he says, as long as the national government does not prevent me from doing this, I'm allowed to do it. He combines it with something referred to as the elastic clause, also called the necessary and proper clause. And what the necessary and proper clause says is that the Congress can pass any law that it sees as necessary and proper to the administration of the United States, meaning that the elastic clause allows the power of the government to stretch. It's the reason that we can have laws about the internet. The founding fathers didn't know anything about the internet, but we can pass laws about it because it's necessary and proper to do so. Hamilton is going to win the argument with George Washington, and the national bank is going to be proposed and accepted and created. Hamilton and Jefferson disagreed on what kind of industry or economy the United States should have. Hamilton wants manufacturing. He's going to have a tariff put in place. A tariff, again, increase the price of foreign products. That's designed to protect domestic or American products, because if foreign goods are more expensive, people will buy American products more often, and it helps create the new businesses. Again, Southerners and farmers dislike tariffs because it not only raises the price of foreign products, but it also raises the price of domestic products artificially. Here's a breakdown of the two parties. We are going to call them the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Do not get Federalists confused here with the Federalists of the ratification debate. These Federalists are wanting a stronger national government, and they're going to use loose interpretation to do so. They're going to be led by Hamilton. They're going to want an industrial economy. They want a national bank. They want a high tariff. They're going to be supported by, and they're going to try to support the creation of wealthy individuals. In opposition to the Federalists are the Democratic Republicans. These Democratic Republicans, which are sometimes called Jeffersonian Democrats or Jeffersonian Republicans, is a little confusing. So we're going to call them Democratic Republicans. They want a weak national government with states having stronger governments. They want strict interpretation because that's going to make the government weaker and give that power to the states. They want an agricultural economy, not industry. They support the common man, meaning the American farmer. And they also don't want a national bank because they think it's a tool of the wealthy, and they don't want a tariff because it artificially raises prices on farmers. They're also going to disagree on foreign conflicts. Jefferson supported the French during the French Revolution, partially because they based their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen on his Declaration of Independence, partially because he believed that revolution was good for keeping people in power in check. Washington, though, is going to stay out of it. In his proclamation of 1793, he says the United States is going to remain neutral in all the European wars because he doesn't want to get pulled into a British-French war. Jefferson is going to support the French. Hamilton and the Federalists tended to side with the British because they had the same economy that he wanted to mirror, to copy. There's something referred to as the Citizen Genet incident, where a Frenchman was trying to come into the United States and he was trying to recruit private American ships to attack British ships, which would have made the British feel like the Americans were siding with the French. So Washington actually had to have him kicked out of the country. And then there's Jay's Treaty, which causes another conflict, which it was really a one-sided treaty with the British, where the British got everything they wanted, the Americans got nothing, and it made the United States look bad, like they were supporting the British, and the French got mad at them. But let's not talk about the foreign policy stuff right now. Let's talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. So the Whiskey Rebellion was about taxes. Pennsylvania farmers that had moved into Western Pennsylvania would grow grain. But by the time the grain got across the Appalachian Mountains, a lot of it would spoil. So instead of trying to take that grain, transport it across the mountains and sell it in the open market, they would turn their grain into whiskey that was more shelf stable. It was easier to transport. They could get a better price for it. So they would make this whiskey and they would sell it, or they even used it as a bit like a currency in their own towns. Hamilton, seeing this, he gives a line about trying to control drinking habits, but that's not true. Well, at least it's not the real reason behind this. He wants to raise money. So he puts a tax on the whiskey. And it's targeting Pennsylvania farmers, which was a Jeffersonian constituency. They voted for Democratic Republicans. There's a whole thing. The Pennsylvania farmers were mad over the whiskey tax, so they rise up and they rebel. They said, we just fought a war about taxes. And Hamilton says, no, you fought a war about taxation without representation, and your representatives agreed to this tax, so you don't have a thing to fight about. Hamilton convinces Washington to lead the federal army into Pennsylvania to put the rebellion down. And Washington does. Because the reason for the federal government being created was to create domestic stability, to put down these domestic insurrections, to make sure that these little rebellions wouldn't pop up like Shays' Rebellion. By the time Washington gets into Western Pennsylvania, he's the first and only president ever to lead the military into battle, by the way. By the time he gets into Western Pennsylvania, the resistance has dissipated. What this shows is that the federal government can now put down domestic rebellions, unlike the time during Shays' Rebellion under the Articles of Confederation. Washington retires after 2 years. He gives a farewell address. In his farewell address, he stresses the importance of maintaining neutrality, of keeping the United States out of foreign affairs. They don't listen. In 1796, another Federalist, John Adams, is going to be elected. John Adams slips into a war. It's called the Quasi-War. It's an undeclared war with France. There's something referred to as the XYZ affair, where some French ambassadors were willing to meet with the Americans, but the Americans had to pay a bribe first. Embarrasses the United States and led to this big nationalist response about how dare they. But more important to us is the war at home, because Jefferson supported the French. Jefferson was openly criticizing Adams and the Federalists. There was no tradition in the United States at this time of what we're going to eventually call the loyal opposition. There was a fear that the Democratic Republicans would rise up and fight the Federalists. John Adams gets Congress to pass something referred to as the Alien Sedition Act. If you speak out against your country, if you speak out against the United States and you haven't been a citizen or you haven't been in the country for a certain number of years, you could be deported. You could also face punishment if you spoke out against the country for other reasons. And essentially, this is targeting the supporters of the Democratic Republicans. In response to that, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson go back to their home states, and respectively of Virginia and Kentucky, and pass the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. In these resolutions, the states try to nullify the Alien and Sedition Act. And by nullify, we mean they try to say that a state does not have to follow the act of the federal government. Now, this doesn't work. States cannot nullify an act of Congress. That would go against the Supremacy Clause. but it's an important precedent because the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to lead to the nullification crisis, which is eventually going to lead to South Carolina's secession before the Civil War. In 1800, the Alien Sedition Act actually backfired on John Adams. Because of the Alien and Sedition Act, the Democratic Republicans have overwhelming support. And there are two candidates because their presidency elections work differently. The two leading candidates that got the most electoral college votes were both Democratic Republicans. They split the election. Neither Jefferson nor his vice president, Aaron Burr, have enough votes to win the electoral college. It goes into the House of Representatives. Thomas Jefferson is made the president. Aaron Burr becomes the vice president, both Democratic Republicans. It's in the election of 1800 that we're going to get this idea of the loyal opposition, that you can be a loyal American and still be a member of the opposite political party. And the idea of peaceful transfer of power, which we'll talk about in the next video.